Hello, I'm Toycat and welcome back to my second channel geography video. This is our series where we talk about geography and the world and stuff. And today I wanted to talk about borders because they're something that personally fascinate me and they're something we haven't spoken about for quite some time. And I figured, you know what, let's bring back the border series by talking about the mother of all border situations, and that is going to bring us to the Middle East. And yeah, discussing the Middle East on a YouTube video, this is going to be a great thing. The comment section is going to be filled with reasonable opinions, not just people yelling about the issue without even watching the video. No, it's not going to be a train wreck or a dumpster fire down there. It's going to be a great constructive time, and that's why I'm looking forward to talking about the borders of Israel, asterisks, because Israel might not even be the country we're talking about today, because here's the deal, right? When it comes to the Middle East, things are very messy because most countries around the world have clearly defined borders and reasons for existing. I mean, the majority of countries around the world have either ethnic or language, pluralism as being the reason for that country. I mean, like, people in Germany speak German. The Polish people of Poland are all roughly ethnically the same. There are minorities, but that is an easy way to, group a lot of countries together. Swedish or Finnish or whatever else. Most countries are grouped together by ethnic or linguistic majorities, and some countries are grouped together by some idea that keeps them together. So the United States, Canada, Brazil, Australia have huge immigrant populations, but the thing that keeps the country together is some form of constitution or some form of idea. Basically it's, there are two ways to have a country: the idea or the kind of like the principles of nature by birth. You can have one of those two things, I guess you could say. But the third option you can have that isn't like something that's inherent about you, something you can have, is you can have a country which is entirely based on religion. So this region of the world is of course filled with countries which are formed not based on necessarily like any ethnic majorities. I mean, look at Iran's demographics for a great example of that, but instead are formed based on religious majorities. And indeed, the religion is intertwined with the state. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to work out which religion it is for most of this area. But if you, because of that, there is a huge kind of schism when it comes to the idea of there being a big Muslim majority area with a transplant Jewish state in there. So is Israel a real country? Well, according to these countries, yes, it is. These are the countries that recognize Israel. A few of them have withdrawn their recognition over the years, and a few countries have even, decided to like kind of suspend the relations but still recognize it. So these are the countries that recognize Israel, and these are the countries that recognize Palestine. There's actually a decent amount of overlap, which means that most countries around the world recognize there are two countries in the region, but more countries recognize just Israel than recognize, Palestine, and a few countries, every country around the world recognizes at least one of the two, and most countries recognize both, which is why, for the sake of this video, we'll say that either country might not exist, but in reality they sort of do. But Israel is definitely the dominant power of the two, and the one that kind of controls the Palestinians, the Palestine interactions of the world in a lot of different ways. So yeah, where is Israel then, and where is Palestine? Well, even just questioning where Israel is a whole mess, because Israel borders 4 other countries. I mean, Israel borders, as you can see, 4 UN member states: Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, and then it borders maybe another country, and potentially one of the solutions is a second, other country, but it's hard to be precisely sure. So the fact that we can't tell how many how many countries Israel has borders with is kind of concerning by itself. But then if you actually look at the borders of any of those countries, every single one of the borders is not fully agreed. I mean, if we look at, for instance, Romania and Serbia, a border is a really easy to look at line on a map that says, oh yeah, on this side of the Danube River, this is Serbia. On this side, it's Romania. If you cross the Danube from this side to that side, not only will you have committed a crime, because it's not an official border crossing, but you'd have gone from Romania to Serbia. Most borders around the world are very much solid. A great example of one that's not, but it's a very tiny part of a huge border that otherwise is, Canada and the United States agree their border pretty well. I mean, it's a straight line in some places, which is crazy because the Earth actually curves, which makes it a curved line. That's how long their borders are. And there's also places with like, oh yeah, did you know the United States and Canada disagree about who owns this island? They both think they do, and therefore there's a lighthouse and an island that both countries claim as their own. It's a very wacky thing that, like, why is that way? Because, countries be wacky sometimes, but it's usually very small disputes. Well, because Israel is very much disagreed with by the majority of its neighbors. Again, even though there are more countries that recognize Israel, it's not all of them, and the ones that don't happen to be most of their neighbors. And indeed, the entire region is very much against the idea of an Israel, because again, it's taking a Muslim majority area and transplanting a Jewish state in there. And you might question, how does this even happen in the first place? Which we have to explain to be like, how does even this happen? So again, I'm going to be talking about this just in terms of how things have happened. A lot of people, when they talk about the Israel-Palestine situation, they talk about their politics and they talk about their solutions and their stuff like that, because very few people get down to the facts, and therefore it's hard to discuss, so let's do that today. If you know about this stuff already, maybe this video is not so interesting, but I want to tell you about the region, because, hey, did you know there used to be something called the Ottoman Empire? The Ottoman Empire is one of history's longest-lasting empires. Here are the regions it was subdivided into, and the regions were very much autonomous, which is one of the reasons that the empire could last so long, while keeping regions as disparate as Bosnia, Bulgaria, Archipelago was obviously Cyprus. We got Egypt, we got Iraq, we've got Kuwait, we've got Syria, all existing under the same empire. Nowadays, Turkey is the kind of successor state to all of that, and the rest is its own independent country. And one of the parts that had to be made independent in the aftermath of World War I was this province right here, Jerusalem. So given, just especially after World War II, where the horrors of what might have happened to a large Jewish population of the world made the powers which were dividing up the region be like, hey, why don't we give a little bit of the region to Jewish people, given that a few of them had already been moving to the area because Jerusalem, obviously a holy site to them. A few of them had moved there already when it was part of the Ottoman Empire. Why don't we just make that region for a Jewish state so they can have a place to be? Obviously, again, when you do this to a area of the world which is you're taking a part of the world which is heavily one religion and you're trying to like shift it another way. That's not going to be popular with any religion. With the Jews, it seems to be like another layer up for lots of reasons. And basically, it was a very unpopular idea, and the idea of a Jewish state was one which was met with some resistance. So this was the initial plan. I can't work out for sure, again, I've dove into this so much, why they decided to have the Palestinian state, the people who obviously were most of the land before. I don't know why they decided, like, why don't we have a Muslim state there and a Jewish state here and have the borders be a mess? It's like 3 separate bits on both sides. Obviously, these bits are kind of linked for Israel, but like, it's basically 3 separate pieces of land to make one state on each side. I can't think of any reason besides like Soviet-style meddling, but the eventual conclusion after the 6-Day War was we ended up with something like this: Jewish land here, Palestinian land here. So these were where the Palestinians live, except by this time, because after that UN plan, which seriously angered their neighbors for reasons that, again, come down to religion and the fact that they're all formed on religion, there's a new country being formed on religion, but a different religion, and also the idea of, like, it's a little bit colonialism linked in, like, some European and Western powers came in and said, hey, you know this land of your neighbor, we're going to give it to an entirely different group of people, something no one would like happening to one of their neighbors. So, yeah, basically, the countries were very upset, and they decided that the Gaza Strip was going to be occupied by Egypt, and West Bank, again, the 2 largest bits of Palestine, were occupied by their corresponding countries. Jordan occupied the West Bank, and Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip. This was actually one of the, like, most peaceful asterisk solutions in a while, but it was broken because in the 6-Day War, where, again, because all of their neighbors hate them, 5 of Israel's neighbors all decided to start a war, or rather they were about to, and then Israel started some preemptive attacks, which makes things even more complex. But basically, during that war, Israel, despite being the smaller military power, won a decisive victory and took over all of the Sinai Peninsula, this area right here. And if you look at this map right here, where you're like, wait, so which country recognizes Israel? Why is Egypt on this list, despite having that same Muslim majority thing? Well, the reason is because Israel took a lot of their land all the way up to the Suez Canal, and in exchange, basically the idea was like, we can have an unofficial border you don't recognize that's right down here, or we can have a border you do recognize, and you can get your Sinai Peninsula back. So that was the agreement, and in exchange, Israel and Egypt have a border which is like the only clean border over here in the Middle East. We've spoken about it before at great length, the other side of things, because Egypt's borders are interesting. But yeah, that is how Egypt and Israel have a border, except the border they agreed also covers Gaza, which was no longer going to be Egypt's territory, but was going to be administered by Israel until a Palestine could be put together. And yeah, if you know about the Gaza Strip, then yeah, about that whole situation, huh? But yeah, so the same thing happened because obviously Jordan invaded. One of the things they got in return was the West Bank and East Jerusalem, this whole area right here, which means that Israel is currently in control of territories that you might call Palestine, or you might not if you're one of these countries, which in this case is like the West, right, minus Iceland and Sweden, like the Western world, plus, what is that, like Burma? They're probably just dealing with other things, honestly. The Western world, as you can see, like the alliance of countries that vaguely correspond with that, do not recognize that there is a Palestine, and therefore this is all Israel and Israel things right now for the time being. So that is why Israel borders a country but also controls the country. This is occupied territory until the borders are finalized, except the Palestinians believe, maybe if you look at this map rightfully, asterisks, they're like, no, actually, we don't want to just have these areas, we want to have it all. And therefore, they kind of exist under Israel and also kind of don't. They're stateless people. It's a whole big mess on that thing. And that is why Israel only has borders defined with Jordan and with Egypt. And because both those borders are defined, it means that the West Bank and Gaza Strip are explicitly not part of those countries anymore. Jordan does not own the Palestinians and the people in the West Bank, and Egypt does not own the Gaza Strip. Instead, they are part of a thing to be made in the future, except that was in that was in the 1960s, and it's been quite some time, and yeah, that's a whole thing. So, more recently in the 1960s, again, they have a lot of disputes with their neighbor, Israel does. If you look at the border between any two countries, you can see how it just says, like, oh yeah, Israel, Egypt, nice and simple. If you look at the border between Israel and Lebanon, you'll see how it says Blue Line 2000, or the UN 2000 Blue Line, and this is because, again, one of the things that happened was a war, and Israel, Lebanon does not recognize Israel as being a state, which means they don't recognize having a border, and therefore the only thing that we have is this UN ceasefire line that's like, hey, we agree not to send our troops over there, you agree not to send your troops over here, and you can administer other people on that side, etc., etc. But it's not an official border, which means Israel doesn't have a border with Lebanon, it just has a ceasefire line that is, you don't want to be going across that, by the way, fun fact. But yeah, so there is a border that is well enough defined and well enough agreed on that one day could become a border. But because Lebanon doesn't recognize Israel, this is not an international border by all of the definitions of that word, and it's a whole mess. A whole mess that's made messier, by the way, because if you look at this again, it's like, oh yeah, this is the blue line. But because Israel also occupies parts of Syria right now, it means their borders that should be between Lebanon and Syria, which Lebanon agrees are the border between it and Syria, are actually borders between it and currently occupied parts of Israel. And then there's parts that Lebanon and Syria disagreed on, Shabba farms in this case, that are actually they're actually controlled by Israel. So again, just to clarify, this is the border between the countries. This is the alternate border if Shabba farms belongs to Lebanon, except Shabba farms right now belongs to Israel down here. That is the mess of the Middle East when you're actually diving into the individual settlement situations. And although Shabba farms can be simply explained as like, oh yeah, it's Shabba farms maybe. It's like, oh yeah, well, it's a complex religious thing that goes back to the things. The actual conflict about it is pretty intense because the countdown for liberating the rest of our lands has begun. Today I confirm the use of all available and legitimate means to achieve this goal, was a quote from the president of Lebanon. So yeah, it's a little bit of a tense region, and that's why Shabba Farms is like, ooh, let's not think about that one too much. So what does they do with this whole area that Israel occupies as part of Syria? Why are there 4 borders between Israel and Syria? Well, again, they're not borders. Syria doesn't recognize Israel. However, the line that they were using as their kind of like ceasefire line, again, the kind of not a border, but we'll keep on this side, you keep on that side, was right here, the one which gave Israel the least territory. But in some preceding wars, Israel occupied parts of Syria all the way up to this area. It's called Golan Heights, and as a result, there's like 4 different lines that represent the divide, and this is very much not Israeli territory by anyone's standards. But one of the problems is that even though this territory doesn't belong to Syria quite, and it is okay by international definitions, it belongs to Syria. Like, legally speaking, you can't just take another country's land. However, Israel has long said, like, hey, we will give you the Golan Heights back if, it's called like land for peace or something. Like, we give you the land back, you give us peace, which is an interesting way to get peace, you could argue. And because Syria is now dealing with other things, and this isn't really their top priority, basically, there is an area of Syria that's been occupied by Israel for quite some time. For so long, in fact, that it's got, like Israeli roads, as you can see, and that Israeli citizens now make up the majority. And that makes things even messier. So do you give the Israeli Jewish citizens over to Syria? Is that the idea? I don't know if that's such a smart thing. So yeah, what is the border? Legally speaking, it is the ceasefire line. As far as ethnically speaking, it includes this area, and that is the mess of having countries be defined by legal standards, despite those legal standards coming from ethnic reasons. Because what do you do here? Well, let me know in the comments. Those comment sections sure are going well right now. Because here's the deal also with the situation with Palestine. So Palestine isn't recognized by most of the world. Again, that is simple enough to say. But what makes it more complex than just like, oh yeah, so there's these two parts that are widely recognized as being Palestine, right? Why is Palestine not a country if we have very vaguely agreed borders for it? Well, the problem is again, Palestine doesn't just want the borders that it vaguely has right here. It wants either most or all of the land, or at least expanded land. And one of the things that has been happening in the interim, while peace has been trying to be agreed, is a lot of settlements from, again, a lot of people from Israel, just individual people, not forced by the government, have been moving into parts of the West Bank. They assume that because this is occupied land, it'll eventually become ours anyway, right? So a lot of settlements in the West Bank, and indeed there used to be some in Gaza. Those have been broken up since then, by the way. But there are a lot of settlements in the West Bank of people who... there's a lot of, like, basically, there's a lot of, like, different, population centers where up to 70,000 Israelis all live inside the territory of what is going to be another country. Again, signing away, when you control that territory where your people live and you know or you feel that they won't be treated well by the place you're trying to give it to, also makes the negotiation even harder. And that's why, even though everyone wants peace in the Middle East, everyone wants there to be, generally speaking, this is the widely agreed upon standard, like two countries, right? Where should those two countries exist? Maybe we disagree. The thing is, during the interim, the people who benefit are the local leaders of both these areas. The Gaza Strip is controlled by Hamas, which is a very radical group that can, they promise a lot of things to their people, and they're in full control. I don't want to go full dictator level when I talk about it, but it's like the people who are locally in charge, they benefit from the current situation at least a little bit, and the people of the West Bank obviously want to control the Gaza Strip. The people of the world, but like the thing is, if you set up a country of these borders, one, there'll be a lot of Israelis in your border, which is a whole issue, and two, you'll have a country which consists of two separate parts which aren't linked in any way. So the status quo that's happened in the meantime is there are a group of people who are in a country that is waiting to be formed, but every moment they wait in the negotiations, which again, it happens a lot because of both sides having issues. Every year that is waited, the negotiating hand for Israel gets stronger, while the negotiating hand for the Palestinian territories gets weaker. If you move this issue 50 years down the line, will there even be a majority of Palestinians in the West Bank? That is the question. And yeah, that is why the idea of having two separate parts ruled by two separate leaders right now, again, one a lot more radical than the other, the two different leaders having very different negotiating goals, and the fact that Israel knows that while these people keep messing, while these negotiations stall, they benefit significantly because, again, those Israeli settlements only get bigger. People only reproduce and have more and more people. By the way, it's such a mess if you want to look at it on a map. That's why I showed you the Wikipedia link. I think I've done you a favor. But the fact that there is 400,000 people living in the West Bank, and that's excluding the east part of Jerusalem, because, hey, did you know that actually the city that Israel calls their capital, Jerusalem, a lot of the world doesn't agree with that, but the capital of Israel, asterisk, Jerusalem, if you look at it, it's like, oh yeah, actually the capital just ends into this border mess, and there's a little exclave over here, which is also sort of part of it, and also all of this, East Jerusalem is basically now Israeli, even though some of it's in what is going to be Palestine, except the Palestine-Israel border, because Israel occupies it, is kind of nothing. Basically, there's this whole mess of a situation where there are parts of Palestine that Israelis are not meant to go into, but as a whole, the Israel security forces do, and as a whole, the two sides have so much tension that results in terror, that results in these things, which push back negotiations, which again favors certain people on both sides, but not the people who just want to have two countries. But that is me explaining the Middle East in a way that no one's going to enjoy. Let's just put it simply and say, how many countries does Israel border? Right now, 4. 2 of those borders are, official. However, both those borders go past a country inside of Israel, asterisk, not a country just yet. 2 of those borders are ceasefire lines, although of those 2 ceasefire lines, one there are 4 different versions of, one of which includes annexed territories, which is now majority Israeli, and then also they border a country which doesn't exist yet, but is fully occupied by them, and which they negotiate with on a regular basis to try and make a solution where both things exist, and it's a whole mess. So what is my solution to this? I would say, honestly, you just have to be, again, if I was a Palestinian, I would just be mad, right, because that's what everyone seems to be in this situation. situation. If I was an Israeli, I would just be mad and blah, 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 blah. But I'm not. I have no interest in the area. I have no political, like, this, that, etc. I think the simplest solution is like everyone says two-state solution. Why not just go 3 states, you know? What you do is you make the West Bank its own country. Palestine, part 1. Make Gaza Strip its own little country as well. It doesn't realistically survive as its own country. Realistically, Egypt keeping it might be better in the long run. Maybe they can decide that for themselves. But I think letting the people decide, you know, just like have a referendum and be like, hey, people of Palestine, you know, maybe you'd have to bypass their leaders for this. Hey, would you like to be part of one Palestine with Gaza or be part of your own Palestine by yourself? And if you do, we can get your passport sorted and all these other issues. Because right now, especially in the Gaza Strip, the defense, the country's defense, all of these different issues are not controlled by the local people. And there's a huge number of issues that come with a country that is entirely inside of another country that need to be fixed probably at some point. But again, every moment these issues aren't fixed is a moment that Israel does quite well, and that is something that is why this thing is a whole mess. Because let's be honest, this is if you talk about Israel, people don't think about the geopolitical side of things. That's what I find fascinating. They think about it on like a political scale, especially because in America it seems to have become like the right likes, you know, really likes Israel, and the left like with Israel. This is how it is in a lot of the world as well. And it's kind of interesting because, yeah, if you look at the actual issue, it's so complicated and flips sides so much because, oh yeah, if you know, because it was the imperialists, the colonialists who came in and decided the Jewish people should have land, so therefore I'm anti-colonialism, I'm pro-Palestine. Except, wait a minute, the Jewish people were persecuted, you know, people, and they're immigrants, you know, immigrants to a native land, and those immigrants are being poorly treated by the people in those lands. They're being bombed in some cases. Okay, flip the left-right spectrum again, and then it's like, oh yeah, so there was a huge war in the area, and that war has led to some huge consequences, and it's like, ooh, show of strength from Israel, flip the sides again, and then it's like, oh yeah, and now what happens is there's a bunch of stateless people who aren't in anything as a result of the actions of the government of both sides. It's like, basically, it's a mess. The reason the Middle East always devolves to it's a mess is because even once you get past this issue, and even if you can magically make Palestine and Israel countries with official borders, etc., even then you wouldn't be dealing with the issue of the fact that, again, most countries will not recognize Israel despite that fact. These countries are very much, because of their religious base for their thing, even though the governments of Saudi Arabia have strong back channels with the governments of Israel. In fact, the two countries are very very secretively openly exchanging information and on the same side in the geopolitical conflict of the region. Even though that is the situation, the countries cannot officially have any channel open with Israel. Their people demand that Israel doesn't exist, and that is a big mess to be in if you are this country. And that is why there's so much like that's why it works on both ends, and that's why the Middle East is a issue that was a mess 50 years ago, might be a mess in 50 years, and until I think honestly, I think one of the easiest things would be like, you know what, if oil wasn't a strategic resource the whole world was vested in, maybe they could work it all out in a way that they enjoyed. It'd involve a lot of deaths, but you know, at least the people in these countries and these countries wouldn't have to care, right? But that's the reality of the situation. We're talking about an issue that is to do with people all the way over here. That just to us, it's just an interesting border situation. To them, their lives are in this crazy state of flux because of decisions that can't be made too easily, because of the fact that this tiny country in the Middle East somehow gets so much money and support from the Western world, and because of its other country gets so much money and support from the region of the world. And again, it's a mess that comes under so many different definitions that you can't simply say it in anything other than the borders of Israel are a mess. It borders 4 to 6 countries, asterisks, in a bunch of ways, asterisks, that aren't clearly defined, asterisks, and that is the situation in Israel. So, yeah, I hope you all enjoyed this video. Fun fact, Ben Gurion International Airport is the most secure airport in the world, asterisks. I mean, like, it's secure because they do a lot of profiling and stuff like that, which, again, you know, flip your opinions once more. It's a whole interesting thing. I'd love to fly through and film it sometime. I guess they'd probably stop me if I did. But yeah, it's a country that takes security very seriously. And maybe you should too by securing your subscription to this channel. That's right, hit that bell and you'll see more videos like this. Read those comments that I might just turn them on approval only, honestly. It's gonna get messy real fast. And that's why you should subscribe. There's no sense made there. But you know what else doesn't make sense? The fact that this is the second channel, and somehow I do care. Goodbye.